Hello and welcome back to Animated Literacy. This is session 12, and in session 12 we're going to be looking at the Shakespearean spelling that I mentioned in session 11. Before we do that, I want to expand just a little bit on what we did in session 11. In session 11 we were learning how to use the labeling of parts to emphasize, reinforce, and teach the vowel patterns that are used to represent vowels in print. And we labeled our pup, and then we called it a dog, and then we labeled its nose and its mouth and its paw and its claw and its tail. And then we plugged that into the wheels on the bus. So we were singing verses like, "The tail on the pup goes wag, wag, wag all around the town." So you can make up verses forever about that one. You could expand that even a little bit further just on that pup drawing. You could also talk about that EA is one way to spell Edgar Eels sound, and then you can talk about that A blank E spells the Abe's sound in face, and you can talk about the I for Ichabod and the for Irving in whiskers, and you can talk about in legs as an alternate. So here we've got Edgar Eels sound spelled with an E, and here we have it spelled with an EA. Here's some more examples of some of the children and their labeling. So here they're labeling a Santa Claus. So of course that's Santa's a favorite labeling of the children. And here's a couple more Santas. And you can see that even though they're copying me, their pictures all look unique. And in many cases I like their pictures better than my own. So then when we plugged that into the wheels on the bus, here we have a verse that goes, "The nose on the mom goes run, run, run all around the office." So I'm guessing that mom had a cold and that she works in an office. And here's another child's version, and this was later when they were no longer copying but independently filling in the blanks and writing their own. And this is where creativity really starts to shine, is when children have enough skills and they have copied enough that they move out on their own. And I find that I don't have to worry about copying, because once children have the skills to work independently, they no longer enjoy copying, and so they start wanting to display their own unique creativity. So here we have "The gum in the machine goes chink, chink, chink all around the town." Now you may find yourself in a situation like I was in, where you are required to use a specific basal reading series that has those little books. Or you may just decide that you want to reinforce animated literacy instruction with little books, whether doing so in the classroom or as a teacher. It's very easy to integrate the little books with animated literacy. And what I end up doing is pre-teaching the little books without using them actually. Put them out on the shelf, and if the children choose to go and pick them up, that's perfectly fine. Then when I want to test the children to see if they have picked up enough skills to read the little book, then I bring them up and I ask them to read aloud from the little book, but not until I have a reasonable confidence that they'll be able to read it well. So here's an example of the little book that read, "I can see a green frog, I can see a brown tree, I can see a black bird." What I do not want the children doing is looking at the picture to guess the text. I want them to be able to decode that text. And here was another sample of a little book that read, "We see a giraffe, we see two elephants," and then it goes on to "we see three," and so forth. So a very simple way of integrating those little books with animated literacy is when you do a drawing, after drawing and labeling as much of the drawing as your children are prepared for, then you simply have them write a sentence across the top of their page. So on this one, the child drew a picture of a tiger. It labeled the tiger's nose, the stripe, the toe, and the claw. And then across the top, the child has written, "I see a tiger." So that's a sentence pattern that comes directly out of the little books. And now we've reinforced it there. Here the child drew a picture of an elf, and this elf has a cap, and it has legs, and it has an arm, and it has a hat. And after drawing and labeling the picture of the elf, the child writes across the top, "I see an elf." And this was an earlier one, so that we weren't labeling parts yet. But the child drew with me a picture of a rat in a hat, and then across the bottom of the page, the child writes, "Here is a rat." And that was a sentence pattern that came directly out of one of the little books that the district was requiring us to teach and to test. So here's some samples of kinds of sentences that you find in those little books. So all you do, once more, is go to the little books, find the sentence pattern, and write it on your page, and then have the children copy that sentence and read it back to you. And now they're getting exposure to the high frequency words and to the sentence patterns that the program may be testing for your management system. In the Draw to Read and Write book, I included simple sentences that incorporate the high frequency words along with the pictures and the nouns that the children are learning to label their pictures with. And so here we've got the pup barks. This is a pop. Moms like hugs. An ox is big. Here is a dad. I see a map. So if you don't have the little books to draw your simple sentences from to reinforce high frequency words, you can simply pull those sentences directly out of the Draw to Read and Write book and have the kids copy those onto their page. So now we're ready to move on into what I call antique or Shakespearean spelling. So we're going to want to give a context for that. This is a sample of how Shakespeare spelled 400 years ago. And so in this book by Bill Bryson tells us that we're not sure how best to spell Shakespeare's name, but then neither, it appears, was he. For the name is never spelled the same way twice in the signatures that survive. And there are 6 signatures that have survived of William Shakespeare, and here are these signatures to see how many different ways he spelled his name. So every time he spelled a word, he spelled it differently, and there was no dictionary back then, so everyone spelled creatively when they were writing their words. So to give children a context for this kind of spelling, we can go to the Magic Treehouse book that reads Stage Fright on a Summer Night. And the Magic Treehouse books are wonderful because they're in a narrative format, like I talked about in the last lesson, and that Robert Sylvester talks about. Being in a narrative format, children are going to automatically access and connect their prior knowledge to the book. And in that process, they're going to meet many facts about 400 years ago. So in this book, 2 children climb up into a treehouse, and the treehouse is a time machine. So it spins around and takes them to England 400 years ago. They cross the London Bridge, they meet William Shakespeare, they act in one of Shakespeare's plays, and they learn a lot of facts about 400-year-old England. Then they get in their treehouse and they travel back again. Just like Shakespeare spelled words that way, in the journals of Lewis and Clark, they spelled the word Sue 27 different ways without spelling it the way that we spell it today. So everyone 200 to 400 years ago was using what many programs call invented spelling. The problem with the terms invented spelling and kindergarten spelling or first grade spelling is that many kids see it as less important than true spelling, and then they end up not writing very well because they're afraid to invent their own spelling for words. So I use Shakespeare and tell them the story of Shakespeare and how he spelled to elevate the level of Shakespearean spelling. So now my children who can hear sounds in words can simply go to the board and see how to spell them. So if they can hear the sound of Ollie Ostrich in a word, they know that they can either use an O, an AU, an AW, or an AL to spell that sound. And so I see a lot of different spellings on their paper. When I come to look at their paper, then I go, wow, you spelled that word just like William Shakespeare might have spelled it. Now, would you like to see how Webster spelled it in the dictionary? And they, of course, always say, sure. And so we now can take a look at the dictionary if we have time and see how the dictionary spelling looks. But these are 2 equal spellings, but they're used at different times. I still use Shakespearean spelling when I'm composing and I don't want to stop to look up a word. So I'll spell it like Shakespeare in the initial spelling, and if no one else is going to read it other than me, I never change it. But if I'm going to put it out for other people to read it, I try to change all of those Shakespearean spelled words to modern spelling or the way the dictionary spells them. So here we look at Ike and we can see that Ike can spell his sound I space E or I blank E, I-E without the space, or Y at the end of a word, or I-G-H. So now my children, by listening for the sounds in a word, segmenting that word, looking up at the board, are connecting all of those spelling patterns to the sounds that they have learned to produce. And we don't worry about two vowels going walking and all those horrible rules that drive us crazy and are unreliable, as we talked about in our last section. So here are some examples of how writing progressed in my classroom. And I've heard many stories from animated literacy that when using the program, the children advance in writing even faster than they advance in reading. So in the early stages, every time I tell a character story and teach a character song, I have the children get a picture of the character. Under the character is the song for the character and the gesture for the character. Then when they get those pictures, they can trace or rainbow write over the letter on the front of the page so they can practice printing it. Then they turn their page over on the back. And now we start to work on accessing prior knowledge. So one of the things that I ask over and over and over again is what are some ways that you are like the character, and what are some ways that you are not like the character? Now I encourage the kids from the second day of kindergarten to try writing about the character on the back. But none of my kids could read or write at the beginning of kindergarten, which is no surprise. So the kids chose to draw. So here, this was on a day that they had been introduced to Kimmy Kangaroo. And Kimmy Kangaroo has two things that the children can relate to in her story. She blows kisses to the kids while they're leaving the petting corral. So we can talk about people who blow them a kiss or people who give them a kiss. And the kids come to pet the animals so they can write about an animal that they like to pet. And so on her paper, Jessica writes, Jessica draws a picture of a giraffe. Now I go behind each child and I say to the child, can you tell me about that picture? And so she says to me, I am petting a giraffe at the petting zoo. So now I write down what she says to me. So I take the dictation. Then I give her a choice, because whenever you give kids choices, you're empowering them and you're starting to guide them from being dependent to being independent. So I said, you can either take a pencil and trace over the top of the words I wrote, or you can use your pencil to write the words underneath. Well, Jessica decided she was going to do both. So she traced over my words and then she wrote them underneath. On the page next to it, there was this picture, and I asked Damon, I said, tell me about your picture. And he says, oh, I petted a camel and he liked it at the zoo. So sometimes I'll correct the children's grammar. I won't tell them I'm correcting it, I'll just rephrase it. And they're perfectly fine with that. On this one, I left it exactly as the child said it. So now I wrote that and he used a pencil to trace over the top. I go behind Mike, and Mike says, I am petting an African spitting cobra. So I wrote that and he traced over the top of it. For the first 3 weeks of school, that's exactly how things took place. Even though I was encouraging my children to write on their own, no child was attempting to do it. So we started school that year on September 1st. This is September 21st, so 3 weeks into the school year. And finally, a child took me up on the offer and decided they were going to write on their own. So when I went behind this child's paper, this string of letters was already there. So we had a celebration. I said, everybody look. Katie did not wait for me. She wrote all by herself. And so I pointed to the letters that she had written. Now, I can't read those letters, but when I asked Katie, she said she could read them. So I said, can you tell me what that says? She says, that says, I pet my puppy in my house. It is raining in my house. So now she can trace over the top of the words I wrote, or she can copy them on her own to see how they would look in a book. I go behind Gabby, and Gabby has also written a string of letters that you see here. So once again, I hold up her paper for all the children to see, and I tell them, look, Gabby didn't wait for me. She wrote all by herself. Now, Gabby, can you tell me what that says? And Gabby reads, my mommy kisses me when she goes to work and when I go into my classroom, and then she traces over the top of that. Now, one of the things that I learned from this group of kids was explosions if we teach in a natural sequence. This was the first class that I had all the research necessary to say, these are exactly the stages and milestones that children go through, and this is the order they go through when they're learning to speak, and that's the order that I'm going to emphasize things. So I read to them from complete books. I exposed them to all of the parts of language and modeled those parts. But when I was working with them in a small group and looking for mastery, I didn't worry about word recognition until they had phonological awareness. I didn't worry about two-word phrases until they could read single words. And I didn't worry about high-frequency words until they got to three-word phrases, because that's the order that language takes place in. Now, what happens when you teach from a natural sequence like that, I learned from this group. They were moving faster than I had ever seen a group move. And I kept coming home and talking to my wife each day, and she taught 33 years of kindergarten, first and second grade. And I said, they've got to hit a wall. Children always hit a wall. They seem to be making progress, and then it stops. And I kept waiting for the wall. The end of the year, the wall had still not happened. So I had to go back to the language research to explain why I never saw the wall. What happens in language research is we have these stages. 2 to 4 months old, they're producing vowels. At the end of that stage, an explosion takes place where they have higher competency with the vowels. And many people call that an aha moment, which projects them into the next stage with consonants. Then they babble, and as their babble gets better and better and better, they reach what's called critical mass in babbling, which propels them to single words. Then they move along slowly in their babbling until they reach about 50, or their single word production, till they can reach about 50 words. And now all of a sudden new words are coming very fast, and that explosion sends them into the two-word stage of development. So what was happening that I didn't understand at first is, rather than my kids hitting walls, they were hitting explosions. And the only way to hit explosions is by teaching in a natural sequence. If you teach in an unnatural sequence, the way reading programs are organized in most cases, then children hit walls instead of explosions. So we can replace those walls with explosions simply by recognizing that there is a natural sequence to language and applying that to the teaching of reading. So now I want to show you the explosions. This was September 21st with Gabby. 1 week later, she was writing this instead of a string of letters. And when I said, what does that say? She told me, that says, I went to a parade and I was in it. Now, if you look at those letters carefully, she has almost spelled all of the words in the sentence that she dictated to me. And then very soon after that, she was writing, this was after we had done Abe, and in Abe's story, he races. So she's telling me how she's like Abe. I like to race my friend. And you can see that very quickly the words are beginning to take shape, and you're much more able to read them. Then on the back of her page, she wrote, I like to race my friend. Then a little bit later, we're going and we're doing the review lessons for Polly Panda. So this is not almost halfway through the school year, but not quite. Now she's writing sentences all by herself that look like this. I am like Polly, because she was to either tell me how she was like Polly or not like Polly. I am like Polly because, and now you can see she's looking up at the board and she's finding how to phonetically spell these words by connecting the sounds to the letters that she sees on the characters' pictures. I am like Polly because I like pink and purple. My friend Alex is with me. And here's another child writing how she is like Polly Panda. And this child writes instead of writing how she's like Polly Panda, on the other side of the page, she's telling me something about Polly Panda. So here she writes, Polly Panda likes to go to school. And here we've got, if you sound that out, it sounds exactly like it's spelled, school. Polly likes to paint. Now, those were kids who were racing along at the higher end of the class. This was a child who was more at the struggling end of the class. And it wasn't really a matter that she was struggling. It's a matter that her background, she wasn't read to like the other kids. She had some other things going on. This was a child who could do mirror writing. And so if I came to her page and she started on the right instead of the left side of the page, you could read it in a mirror. But if she remembered to start on the left side, then it would read like normal print. And so on her paper, she is now writing, I like to tickle like Timmy Tiger, my sister. And Timmy Tiger tickles, so this is how she is like Timmy Tiger. So you can see there's a real range of where the children are, but they're all progressing along that continuum. Here's a picture of Carla about the middle of the year. Now, Carla started the year, she had just moved to the United States from Peru. She did not speak a single word of English. But because the sequence that I'm teaching in matches the way that you learn oral language, she's acquiring her oral and her written language all at the same time. So here's how she tells me that she is like Polly Panda, because Polly Panda likes to paint. So she writes, I like to paint beautiful, and she's got beautiful. So some of her spelling is going to be different because she still has quite an accent. And so she's writing the sounds that she hears in a word, which may not be the same sounds that I hear in a word. I like to paint a beautiful heart. I like to paint a star. And down at the bottom, she's got a picture of her with the star she painted and the heart that she painted. This is another child from the high end of the room, and this class had a lot of top kids. And so this child is telling me how she's like Polly Panda. She writes, I like to paint a beautiful picture for my mom, and she will like it, the end. And you can see there the spelling of beautiful and picture is very phonetic. So once again, she's looking at the chart. Now that was mid-year. Here's that same child, the end of the year. Now as we went through actually all of the 91 character lessons 3 times in the course of that kindergarten. So the first time through we used the basic lessons, and the second and third time through we used the review lessons that are included in the Story, Song, and Action book. So here, as we're getting to the end of the year, the kids are now getting a puzzle of the songs for the characters. And so on this day they did a puzzle for Baby Barnaby's song, and it sounds like this. Baby Barnaby likes to bounce, bounce and bend and play banjo, bounce and bend and balance bees, bounce and bend in Boston's band, but he bumped a bumblebee and he broke his blue banjo. So now their early writing is all writing about themselves because that's what they know about. But as each character and each drawing is introduced, we're reading both fiction and nonfiction or informational text. And so for Baby Barnaby, we're talking about balancing and reading books about that and about banjos and bands and bending and bumblebees. So on this day, I asked the children to choose any topic they wanted from the song and to write about it. And so this child writes expository text about a bumblebee. And this is just her first draft. There's been no editing done. She writes, bumblebees can sting you, and some people are allergic to bumblebee stings. Bees sting because you are bother them, and bees die when they sting people. The end. So now when you look, you see that almost all of her spelling is now becoming dictionary spelling or modern or conventional spelling. But she still comes to a word here and there that she has not seen enough times. Now the reason that the spelling is developing so quickly is because of rereading. I was using the concept from the National Reading Panel that fluency comes from rereading. So they're seeing these words over and over in the drawing lessons, in the pattern song lessons, in the puzzles, and they're starting to get a visual image of what those words look like, and so their spelling is improving. But when she comes to the word allergic, she's probably never seen that word before. So she reverts to Shakespearean spelling, and all my kids were comfortable with Shakespearean spelling. So when you're teaching with animated literacy, it's important to remember, move from sounds to letters, not letters to sounds. Because if the kids know the sounds, they can simply look at the board, find at least one way to spell them, and then they can write any words that they can think of and to express themselves. Well, thank you very much for joining me, and I hope to see you in the next session.